And now, it's time for another Dice Tower review with the Game Boy Geek.
Hello my friends, it's the Game Boy Geek here. Today, get your marching snare, because we're going back to 1775, back to the original 13 colonies. We're going to be seeing some battles between the British troops and the American troops in 1775 Rebellion. All sorts of the time where Paul Revere rode his horse back where I grew up and born in the Boston area. And we're going to be seeing how the four different factions from the two different sides dealt with each other. Oh, and how Native Americans played a role in it. How the Germans and the French played a role in it. We're going to learn history through an amazing game called 1775 Rebellion from Academy Games. It's from 2 to 4 players. It is a war game, but don't worry, it's not like a typical war game. This one's actually, well, for me, well, let's see. I'll show you, and I'll get to my final thoughts a little later. One cool thing is the insert for this box, which really allows you to separate out the different armies really cleanly, and the dice, and the cards, and the pawns, and other sorts of things. So really good, useful insert for a change in a game. Nice to see. Now the rules also give you a lot of good history, about 4 pages worth of what happened with the American Revolution. So it actually helps you understand thematically how things work in the game as well, and how the two different sides and why they're different, both in dice and cards. For example, I must have been asleep in history class when they taught us about the German soldiers came on to be on the British side and they were wearing orange. I totally forgot all about that, but it teaches you about that just in the rulebook, which is really cool. You'll be playing on one of 2 different sides in the game. You'll be playing on the British side, which is the Redcoats or the Yellow Loyalist Militia. As you see, they use those cards and cubes for armies and dice. Or you'll be playing on the American side, which is the Continental Army or the Patriot Militia, white and blue respectively. And in addition to those 4 factions from those 2 different sides, you're going to have some orange Germans that are going to be on the British side that will come into play during the game. We'll have some purple French that come into play in the game for the American side, and there'll be some Native Americans that will be neutral and will ally to either sides. And that's sort of the 2 different sides, 4 different factions. And you'll be playing one of these 2 sides with a 4-player game. Each person will have their own faction and you'll be teammates. Or if you're playing a 2-player game or similar like that, each person will basically run both factions on one side. There's 3 different scenarios you can set the board up with. There's a quick 30-minute game, there is a normal game, and then there's a specific 2-player advanced game. This is the normal game set up here at the beginning, and the board is actually much larger in person than it appears in video. It's a very large, gorgeous board. And printed on the board, you can see that guides you to set up. So Pennsylvania, the bottom, in Philadelphia, you'll see 1 red and 1 yellow. And then just to upper right there, you see 2 whites. And it's just easy to set up because the board kind of has things how they're supposed to get set up. Now the object of the game is to have more colonies than the other side when the game ends, and a colony essentially is a state in this example. This Pennsylvania is one sort of color. It's one big colony with a bunch of different areas, but maybe you look at Delaware and this is one colony, but it's just one area because it's small. And if at any point in time one side controls the entire colony, they will get a flag showing this, so the British own this area. Just likewise, the US owns Connecticut because there's no enemies there, it's all just the Americans. So that's how you can tell who has control of a certain colony. And at the end of the game, whoever has more of those flags out representing those much colonies is the one that's going to win the game. That's what we're trying to do. The game also comes with a nice player aid, 1 per side, that talks about the sequence of play, the different dice, and we're going to be using this to show you how a round works. So let's get into it. At the beginning of a round, you have 1 die for each of the 4 factions. These are all blank. You're going to throw these in the bag and you're randomly going to pull one out, and that's going to be the first turn of the game is going to be yellow. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to do the reinforcements phase. So they're going to take 4 yellow cubes because they're the yellow army this turn, that's whose turn it is. They're going to take 4 of these and they're going to place them into any city of a colony that they own. And let's take a look at that. So to start the game, the British own Delaware, Quebec, and Nova Scotia because there's no enemy people in those territories. And they can add those to any of the cities. So let's say he adds 2 to Quebec City. Here we have Halifax down here. We could add 1 there. Maybe we add 1 in Delaware there. So that's the end of his reinforcements phase. If there were some guys that had fled from battle, they would be in this area here. We'll talk about that later, but those would also get put out now as well. The next phase is we're going to go and we're going to do a movement phase. Each player has a deck of cards here, and they'll have 3 of these in their hand at the beginning of this stage. So here's a possible hand here of 3 cards. Now these would be held secret, of course, from the other team, but they can be shared with the other people on his side, like the redcoats. And he has 2 movement type of cards. So there's 2 types of cards, movement and events. And at this point, you got to have at least 1 movement card. And event cards can be played anytime it pretty much says you can. This says play in the reinforcements phase. So if that phase when I was placing my my guys, as you just seen, I could have played this and added 2 of the Germans plus all my fled guys to my reinforcements. So I could have added those guys along with them here because, again, the Germans are on our side, and that's one of the ways you get those allies is pretty much by cards. Now, these are 2 different types of movement cards. We have land and water. Let's talk about land first. How this works is it says you can take up to 3 different armies and move them up to 2 spots. Now, an army can be any amount of basically cubes, but they have to include at least 1 of your own, and we're yellow, remember? So I could take maybe these guys and 2 reds, and we'll make that my army. We'll leave 1 behind, and we can move it up to 2. So this is 1 area here. So we could basically move up to 2, and we can stop and go right into here. And as soon as you get into an area where there's either Native Americans that are not allied or in an enemy territory, they stop and a battle will end up happening there. So that's 1 of my armies. We'd have 2 more that we could move. Maybe this one takes 1 yellow and 2 of the Germans with them and goes 1, 2, and that one will be a battle. And maybe he takes these 2 guys and 1. And again, if you run into either unallied Native Americans or enemies, you have to stop. And why would we want to do that? Well, Native Americans are neutral until they are met with one of the 2 sides. As soon as they're met with the 2 sides, they are now allies. So these Native Americans are part of the British side. And of course, if they go into battle, they get their own dice for that side. Also, the big reason for this is even if the British side owned this whole New York, let's just say these cubes weren't here, New York was just this. If there's any Native Americans that are not allied, you do not control this colony yet. You would need to move this army in here to ally with them, and only once that happens, you would be able to control that colony. So if there's any enemies or unfriended Native Americans or unallied Native Americans in there, you do not control it. You basically have to be the only one there. No enemies and no unfriended or unallied Native Americans. Okay, now dice usually wouldn't sit on the table like this, but in East to show you how this works, I wanted to do so. Here's a battle in this, and either battle, there's 2 of them, can get done in the order of the person whose turn it is tells them. So in this case, we've got these 3 guys versus these 3 guys. The defender always rolls first. Now look, blue has 2 guys there, and he has 2 dice. He'll be rolling these. White only has 1 guy. He actually has 3 dice, but because there's only 1 guy there, he's only going to get to roll 1. So the people on this are going to roll these simultaneously because of their defense, and we're going to see what happens. There's a few things on the dice. There's number 1, there's hits. Number 2, there's fleas, and number 3, there's blanks. Those are really the 3 different things that dice can do. A hit essentially means, well, the team that was attacking is going to get hit, and they get to choose which one of these guys dies. And maybe he just says, well, okay, one of the redcoats is gone, and he goes back into the stockpile off the board. So that dice is resolved. The flea gets, the hits and the fleas always get resolved first, and then the blanks last. We'll talk about that in a minute. The flea is one of these guys will then flee, and they actually go to this fled area, and they will stay there until the reinforcements phase, which is that first phase we showed you at the beginning. They sort of get them back. So that's flee. And then the last one is command decision. This essentially allows them an option to move into any adjacent area if they want to. So this white person could move into any adjacent area as long as it doesn't only have enemies in it. So he can move here, he can move to an empty area, or he could stay in fight. Let's just say he stays in fight for right now. Then, once those are resolved, we have 1 dice of each of these are going to roll, and they would do the same thing, and the same types of things, hits. These guys would get to decide which one dies, and after in this, he would have a command decision to see if he wants to leave. And now that both sides have fought, if there's still people here, we go through another round, and you continue to do that until only one side owns this. So let's say this guy ended up getting killed. Well, this colony is no longer owned by, Connecticut's no longer owned by America because it's split between the 2 of them, and that's how you would resolve a battle. Now, the real interesting thing is the different dice of the different types of armies have different characteristics. For instance, the Reds, the Redcoats, they have 3 hits. So basically half of their dice, you have a 50% chance of getting a hit, and they never run. Where their buddies, the Loyal Militias, only have 2 hits, and they run quite a bit. and their German friends hit a lot and they run a little bit. So you can see how it goes from strong to weak in the different types of armies, and so each of the dice and factions sort of play and feel a little bit differently, which is very interesting. Now you would have resolved both battles, and then after the battles you would have just drawn up to 3 cards. I had used 2 cards. I used this movement and an event card. I would draw 2 more cards, and this is what would be in my hand for next round. And essentially we would be ending yellow's turn. And then the next player, we would draw it randomly, it would be blue, and then after the 4th turn, it would then go to round 2, these would go back in the bag, we'd start a new round. Another interesting thing is each faction's deck is a little bit different. They have different event cards, they have different types of moving cards depending on their faction. So like, you know, some event cards for the redcoats would be replace 1 blue continental army with 1 of your red ones in 1 area. Or place 6 of those Germans, those allies, into Nova Scotia, even if enemy occupied. And then we have the truce card. Every faction has a truce card, and what this tells us is that 1, 2, 3, 4 armies can move up to 2. And this card is very important because after you play this, it doesn't go into the discard pile, it actually sits by the side of the board. Now, this actually helps trigger the end game. If, after the end, beginning at the end of the 3rd round, if both factions from one side, or both sides, if all 4 of them are out there, or even just 2 from the same faction are out, by the end of the 3rd round, at the end of each round, including the 3rd, you're going to check to see if they're out. If they are, that ends the game, and whoever has more colonies, the score, wins, and if it's tied, nobody wins. All right, 1775, wow. First, gotta say, I was at Gamma. I was talking to the guys at the Academy Games booth, telling them how much I loved Freedom, the Underground Railroad, and he said, you gotta try 1775 Rebellion. I said, I hate war games. I don't like them. It's like, well, if you don't like war games, you'll like this one. Trust me, you just gotta trust me, take it. So I took it to review, and I am so glad he talked me into it, because this game is probably the only war game I'll keep, or it's definitely gonna be the only one that I have after this, because I really, really love it. First of all, I love games with historical themes. And Academy Games did this greatly in this game with the 3 or 4 pages of rules at the end that told you about the history. Now, I grew up in Boston. I see the Paul Revere statue. He rode through Lexington right next to the town that I grew up in. I know a lot about that, but I must have been sleeping in the history class when they talked about the French and the Germans, because I didn't remember them at all in the Revolutionary War. I remember the Boston Tea Party. But how those different factions can bring those allies in, and how the Native Americans can go on either side, and how the militia groups from both factions flee a lot, because hey, they were fighting for them, but when the push came to shove, those are the first guys to leave. The Redcoats, these are these strong guys that stood up for nothing, they ran for nothing, and they never run, just like in this game. So I love how all 4 factions are completely different from each other. They're thematic, they're fun to play. Every time you play the game, if you play with a different faction, you're gonna have a different feel to it. Personally, I like it best with 4. I like playing team versus team. We had a player in our group that does not like team games, does not like cooperative play at all. They're more of a Euro gamer and they prefer the 2-player method, but it plays well either way. So it depends on which is your preference. Overall, the streamlined gameplay, it's easy to understand how battles are won and played. The way the dice roll and how each person's dice is different is awesome in this game. It really adds a lot of interesting things that happen in the battles. There's some decisions to be made, but it's not like this over complex. It's a very simple, I would call it a light to light medium war game, but it is fun. It's really fun. Since there's 3 scenarios, I hope in the future to see that they come out with some more scenarios. Not that I would really ever get bored, because I think every time you play this game, it's going to feel different too, depending on the players, what side you're on, and the different event cards you draw. So there's enough luck involved that keeps it honest. So I think true hardcore wargamers are not going to like this game, but I think people that don't like war games or people that are kind of wishy-washy on them, you have to try this game. It's amazing. It blew my socks off. It is excellent. I love the history. I love the gameplay. I love the simplicity. There's pretty much not anything there's nothing I don't like about it. Maybe it could have been a little shorter, but hey, you can end it as early as the 3rd round sometimes. It says 1 to 2 hours. I'd say it's probably pretty accurate. But if you want to play a shorter game, play the short scenario. It's 30 minutes. Anyway, check it out. Even if you're not into war games, try this one just like I did. You might like it. 1775 Rebellion.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at DicetowerNetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff, in stock. Check them out at coolstuffinc.com.